The emergency klaxons on military station Keithel Prime screamed through corridors like wounded animals, which was fitting, considering the species that built the place. Commander Hickscore's secondary eyelids flickered rapidly. A Caltharian stress response he hadn't experienced since his first actual combat deployment. And that, frankly, had been less terrifying than this. 3 cubs were missing. Not just any cubs, Fleet Admiral Uxmoth's cubs. Hickscore's claws scraped against the command console as he pulled up the security grids, his scaled fur bristling in patterns that would have gotten him demoted for showing weakness if anyone had been paying attention. Fortunately, everyone else was too busy panicking in their own dignified, military-appropriate ways. Which was to say, barely controlled chaos with excellent posture. "Report!" he growled at Lieutenant Corix, who looked like he'd rather face a plasma rifle than deliver the news. "Sir, the Cubs were last confirmed in Training Sector 9 at the 18th hour. Standard combat drills, close quarters tactics, the usual curriculum for their age bracket." Corix's tongue flicked nervously across his fangs. "They were dismissed to their quarters. They never arrived. How long?" 6 hours, sir." 6 hours. 6 hours of the Fleet Admiral's offspring wandering a military installation orbiting a gas giant, surrounded by weapons, airlocks, and approximately 15,000 ways for small, overconfident predators to get themselves killed. Hickscore was going to be executed. Slowly, possibly in front of the entire fleet as an example. Lockdown status implemented. All sections sealed. Search teams deployed to the human sectors too? Corix paused. "Sir, the Cubs wouldn't go near the human. Protocol strictly forbids." "Protocol," Hickscore interrupted, his voice dropping to that dangerous frequency that made junior officers reassess their life choices. "Also strictly forbids Cubs vanishing into thin air. Check. Everything." The search teams had been methodical, professional, and increasingly desperate. They'd swept the weapons ranges, the combat simulators, the hydroponic gardens where Cubs sometimes hid when they wanted to ambush each other. They'd checked the meditation chambers, though calling them that was generous, since Caltharian meditation mostly involved staring at weapons until you achieved mental clarity through anticipated violence. Nothing! It was Lieutenant Corix, checking the less prestigious sections of the station, who finally triggered his comm with the kind of hesitation that preceded career-ending statements. "Commander, we've located them." Hickscore's relief lasted exactly half a second. "Where?" "Section 12. Human Liaison Quarters." The relief evaporated. "The humans' quarters. Are they injured? Has the soft skin taken them hostage? I want armed teams." "Sir." Corix's voice had taken on a strange quality. Confusion, maybe. Or the early stages of a private mental breakdown. "You need to see this yourself." Which was how Commander Hickscore found himself standing outside the door to Finley's quarters, flanked by 6 heavily armed soldiers, trying to decide if he was about to rescue Cubs from a dangerous alien or explain to Fleet Admiral Uxmoth how his offspring had been kidnapped by the station's maintenance technician. Finley, the human. The soft, furless creature who'd been contracted 6 months ago because, apparently, only humans understood the perversely complicated systems they'd designed for the station's environmental controls. The one who smiled too much, walked too slowly, and had the survival instincts of a particularly optimistic plant. The one who definitely, absolutely, should not have 3 military Cubs in his quarters. Hickscore keyed the override code. The door slid open with a soft hiss. The scene inside made every tactical protocol in his brain short-circuit simultaneously. All 3 Cubs, Ixpel, Morthic, and Hulnai, offspring of the most decorated military commander in the fleet, heirs to a bloodline that stretched back 6 generations of undefeated warriors, were piled on and around the human like he was furniture. Asleep. Not just asleep. They were purring. Hixcor's world tilted slightly. Caltharian cubs didn't purr. That sound was a biological artifact from their pre-sentient evolution, a vulnerability reflex that proper military training suppressed by age 3 at the latest. It meant contentment, safety, the absence of threat. It meant weakness. Ixpel, the eldest at 9 years, had her head tucked under Finley's chin, her smaller arms wrapped around his torso. Morthic was draped across the human's lap, his tail twitching occasionally in whatever dream had captured him. Hulnai, the smallest, had somehow wedged herself between Finley's side and the cushioned surface he was slumped against, her breathing deep and even. The human himself was also unconscious, head tilted back, mouth slightly open, in that undignified way humans slept. A blanket. Who kept blankets on a military station? Was partially covering the entire pile. The remains of some human food substance were scattered on a nearby surface, and a view screen flickered with whatever entertainment humans consumed when they weren't fixing things. One of Hixcor's soldiers made a strangled sound. "Are they?" Lieutenant Corix started, then stopped, apparently unable to finish any sentence that made sense of this. "Breathing," Hixcor confirmed, his tactical assessment autopilot kicking in despite his brain's broader shutdown. "Uninjured. They appear to be resting." "Sir, should we extract them?" That was the question, wasn't it? Standard protocol said yes, immediately, with maximum efficiency. But standard protocol had been written by Caltharians who'd never encountered a situation where their cubs voluntarily sought proximity to another species for purposes that appeared to be comfort. Hixcor took a wee step into the room. Hulnai's ear twitched, tracking the sound, but she didn't wake. Didn't even tense. She just burrowed slightly deeper into the blanket, making a small chirping sound that Hixcor's species had supposedly evolved beyond. "Commander," Corix whispered, "the Admiral is going to be informed that we've located his offspring, alive and unharmed." Hixcor's claws retracted slightly. "After I understand what in the name of our ancestors is happening here." He moved closer, examining the scene with the same attention he'd give a potentially explosive device. The cubs showed no signs of distress, no injuries, no restraints, no indication of coercion. Their scales had the healthy gleam of properly fed younglings. If anything, they looked better than they had during inspection yesterday. Morthic's stress patterns around his shoulder ridges had faded. Ixpel's chronically tense muscles were loose. The human, Finley, his designation was Finley, shifted slightly, and all 3 cubs adjusted with him, maintaining contact without waking. Like they'd done this before. Like this was routine. That thought made Hixcor's secondary eyelids flicker again. "Pull the security footage," he ordered quietly. "Last 48 hours. I want to know how many times the cubs have been in this section." Corix worked his datapad for a moment, then went very still. "Sir." "How many times, Lieutenant?" 18 visits in the past 20 days. The number hit like a plasma round. 18 times. 18 times the Admiral's cubs had left their designated quarters, evaded monitoring protocols, and made their way to the human sectors. 18 times they'd apparently done this, whatever this was. "Why?" Hixcor said to the room in general, to the universe, to any deity that might be listening. "Didn't our security systems flag this?" "They did, sir." Corix sounded miserable. "Filed under low-priority social visits. The Cubs weren't in danger. No protocol violations were triggered, and the human is authorized station personnel, So nobody thought to mention that military Cubs were having social visits with an alien? Hickscore's voice climbed half an octave. In our defense, sir, Cubs having social anything seemed unlikely. That was fair. Caltharian Cubs didn't socialize. They trained. They competed. They established dominance hierarchies. They didn't visit. They certainly didn't cuddle with maintenance technicians from species with embarrassingly low body temperatures and no natural weapons. A soft sound made Hickscore spin, claws extending reflexively. Finley was waking up. The human's eyes opened slowly, because, of course, humans couldn't even wake efficiently, and focused with the delayed processing speed of someone dragged unwillingly from deep sleep. He looked at the armed Caltharian soldiers crowding his quarters, looked at Commander Hickscore's combat-ready stance, looked at the security override still flashing on his door panel. Then he looked down at the 3 Cubs sleeping on him, and his face did that thing human faces did when they were simultaneously annoyed and resigned. "Oh," Finley said, his voice rough with sleep and completely, bizarrely calm. "Right. I guess they've been gone a while, haven't they?" Hickscore stared at him. "You guess? What time is it?" Finley squinted at a chronometer, careful not to disturb Hulnai. "Third shift? Yeah, okay, that tracks. They showed up around, what, 9th hour? 10th? We were watching a movie." "A movie? Human thing. Moving pictures, tells a story. They like the ones with spaceships." Finley yawned, which displayed his flat, useless teeth. "Should have sent them back after, but they were tired and I figured a few hours wouldn't hurt." Several things happened in Hickscore's brain simultaneously, none of them productive. He settled on the most pressing question. "You figured?" "Yeah, I mean, look at them." Finley gestured vaguely at the pile of apex predator Cubs, using him as a bed. "They're exhausted. When's the last time they actually slept properly? They are military Cubs. They sleep on designated schedules between training." "Right, the training." Something shifted in Finley's expression, something that looked almost like anger, which was startling because humans generally treated Caltharians with the nervous respect due to species that could bite through metal. The training that has them running combat drills for 18 hours straight. The training that's got Ixpel's scales falling out from stress, and Morthic so sleep-deprived he can barely focus. The training that's giving Hulnai anxiety tics. The silence in the room could have been weaponized. "You're criticizing Caltharian child-rearing protocols?" Hickscore said it slowly, testing whether the sentence made more sense when spoken aloud. It didn't. "I'm saying they're kids," Finley replied, and there was definitely heat in his voice now. "And kids need more than drills and discipline. They need downtime. They need to feel safe. They need—" He cut off as Ixpel stirred, making a small questioning sound. Without thinking, Finley's hand moved to scratch gently behind her ear ridges, and the cub settled immediately, purring, resuming. Every Caltharian in the room watched this happen with the kind of attention usually reserved for incoming missiles. "They need someone to be nice to them," Finley finished quietly. Commander Hickscore had fought in 6 major engagements, commanded 3 different vessels, and earned commendations for tactical brilliance in situations where most beings would have simply died screaming. None of that had prepared him for trying to process what he was witnessing. "I need," he said carefully, "to contact Fleet Admiral Uxmoth." "Sure." Finley shifted slightly, trying to extract himself without waking the cubs. He failed. All 3 of them clung tighter. and Hulnai made a distressed sound that was frankly heartbreaking. Or maybe give them another hour? They really do need the sleep. That is not how this works. Yeah, well, maybe it should be. Lieutenant Corix made a sound like someone choking on their own tongue. Hixcore couldn't blame him. Humans didn't talk back to Caltharian commanders. Humans certainly didn't suggest that Caltharian military protocols were somehow inadequate. But Finley was looking at him with those strange, forward-facing eyes that humans had, and there was something in his expression that made Hixcore think of… what? He wasn't sure. Determination, maybe. Or that peculiar human stubbornness that made them willing to argue points they couldn't possibly win. Or maybe just someone who genuinely, bizarrely, cared about 3 cubs that weren't even his species. Hixcore's calm chirped. He already knew who it was before checking. The universe had that kind of timing. "Commander," came Fleet Admiral Uxmoth's voice, and it carried the kind of controlled rage that preceded planetary bombardments. "I understand you have located my offspring." "Yes, Admiral. They are unharmed." "Then why," Uxmoth said, each word precisely enunciated, "am I receiving reports that they are in the humans' quarters?" Hixcore looked at the scene in front of him. 3 cubs who should have been terrified, restrained, or at minimum alert, instead sleeping peacefully on an alien who fed them snacks and let them watch movies. 3 cubs who'd apparently been doing this for weeks without anyone noticing because it seemed too absurd to be real. 3 cubs who, for the first time since Hixcore had seen them, looked like children instead of trainee soldiers. "Admiral," he said, making a command decision that would either save his career or end it spectacularly, "I think you should see this for yourself." Fleet Admiral Uxmoth arrived in exactly 12 minutes, which was impressive considering he'd been in the command sector on the opposite end of the station. It was less impressive when you considered he'd probably sprinted the entire way with the kind of speed that suggested someone was about to die horribly. Hixcore had used those 12 minutes to clear the corridor, post guards at strategic distances, and contemplate whether his military pension would transfer to his surviving broodmates after his execution. The Admiral didn't enter so much as manifest, filling the doorway with a presence that made the room feel significantly smaller. Uxmoth was massive, even by Caltharian standards, his scaled fur carrying the darker patterns of age and countless battles. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso. Caltharians wore their military decorations on their skin. His eyes, all 4 of them, gleamed with the kind of intensity that had made enemy fleets reconsider their life choices. He looked at Hixcore, looked at the guards, looked at the open door to the humans' quarters. Then he looked inside. For a long moment, the universe held its breath. Finley, credit to the human, didn't flinch, mostly because he was still trapped under 3 sleeping cubs and couldn't move without waking them. But Hixcore was willing to count it as courage. The human met the Admiral's 4-eyed stare with the kind of calm resignation of someone who'd already accepted the weirdness of his situation and decided to just ride it out. "Admiral," Finley said, like he was greeting a neighbor, not the most decorated military commander in 3 systems. Uxmoth's claws extended. Slowly. The sound they made sliding from their sheaths was like knives being sharpened. "You are holding my offspring." "Technically," Finley replied, glancing down at the cubs, "they're holding me. I tried to get up twice. Didn't work." As if to demonstrate, Morthic's grip tightened in his sleep, and the cub made a small grumbling sound that was completely at odds with his supposedly fierce military heritage. One of Uxmoth's secondary eyelids twitched. "Explain," the Admiral said, in the tone that expected compliance or carnage, "how my cubs came to be in your quarters." Explain why they appear to be sleeping on you. Explain? His voice dropped to something dangerous. Why I was not informed that they have been visiting you for 20 days. 18 visits, Hickscore corrected automatically, then immediately regretted opening his mouth. Uxmoth's head swiveled toward him with predatory precision. 18. Sir, the security logs. Show me. Corix, who'd been trying to become one with the wall, reluctantly stepped forward with his datapad. The footage played in compressed time. Cubs slipping through corridors during off hours, the door to Finley's quarters opening, small forms entering. Hours passing. Cubs leaving again, always during shift changes when monitoring was lightest. 18 times. 18 times his offspring had abandoned their quarters, their training, their proper schedules to visit a human. Uxmoth watched the entire compilation in silence. When it finished, he turned back to Finley with an expression that could have flash-frozen a star. You lured them here. No, sir. Finley's voice stayed level. They showed up on their own. First time was maybe 5 weeks ago. I was doing maintenance on the environmental systems in this section, and Ixpel found me. Just sat there watching me work. Didn't say anything. Just watched. And you didn't report this? Report what? A kid watching someone fix an air filter? Didn't seem worth bothering anyone about. Finley shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable under the weight of sleeping predators. She came back the next day. Then she brought Morthic. Then all 3 of them started showing up. And you fed them. Uxmoth gestured at the scattered remains of whatever human food substance littered the small table. Popcorn. It's just corn that's been heated until it pops. They liked it. Finley's expression softened slightly. They were hungry, Admiral. Not for food. Your feeding schedules are fine. They were hungry for, I don't know, something different. Something that wasn't drills and combat assessments. They are military cubs. Drills and combat assessments are their purpose. They're children. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Uxmoth took a step forward, and even Hickscore, who'd served with the Admiral for 15 years, felt the urge to back away. You presume, Uxmoth said, each word precise as a laser cut, to lecture me on the raising of Caltharian offspring? You, who come from a species so soft you require artificial environments to survive? Who have no claws, no natural armor, no killing instinct? Yeah, Finley said, and there was something like steel in his voice now. I do. Because I've been watching your kids for 5 weeks? And you know what I see? Ixpel's scales are falling out. He gestured carefully at the sleeping cub. See those patches on her shoulders? That's stress. Physical manifestation of psychological pressure. Morthic hasn't been sleeping properly. You can tell by the color variations around his eyes. And Hulnai, enough. Uxmoth's voice could have cut through hull plating. Has developed a tic in her left forelimb that shows up whenever she thinks she's disappointed someone. The silence that followed was absolute. Huxcore, despite having no desire to insert himself further into this situation, found himself looking at the cubs with new attention. Ixpel's shoulders did have irregular scale patterns. Morthic's eye ridges showed discoloration, and Hulnai's left forelimb twitched slightly, even in sleep. How had he never noticed that? How had none of them noticed? They are being trained, Uxmoth said, but something in his voice had shifted. Not softer. Nothing about the Admiral would ever be soft, but less certain. Prepared for military service. This is our way. Your way is hurting them. Finley said it quietly, without accusation, but the words landed like an artillery strike. Uxmoth stared at him, at the human who had somehow, impossibly, looked at 3 Caltherian military cubs and seen something other than trainee soldiers, who'd fed them popcorn and let them watch movies, and apparently given them something they'd been desperate enough to sneak through a military station to find. "Show me," the Admiral said finally. "Show you what?" "What you do with them. When they visit." Uxmoth's claws retracted slightly. "I would understand what has corrupted my offspring's training discipline enough that they choose your quarters over their duty." Finley blinked. "It's not corruption. It's just... hang on." He reached for a data pad on the nearby surface, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the cubs. After some one-handed manipulation, the other arm was trapped under Morthic. He pulled up a file and turned the screen toward Uxmoth. The footage showed Finley's quarters from a different angle, recorded from his personal device. All 3 cubs were there, but younger. This was from weeks ago. They sat in a semicircle, watching Finley's view screen with an intensity usually reserved for tactical briefings. But they weren't watching combat footage or training modules. They were watching something with bright colors and exaggerated sounds, and, Hixcor's brain struggled to process this, they were laughing. Not the aggressive challenge laughter of dominance displays, not the harsh barks of victory over defeated opponents. Real laughter, the kind that came from genuine amusement, from joy. "That's from a human children's program," Finley explained. "Animated adventure story. Good versus bad. Heroes protecting people, that sort of thing. They loved it." The footage continued, showed Finley producing a ball of some fibrous material, yarn his memory supplied, and tossing it across the room. Showed all 3 cubs pouncing on it with the kind of enthusiasm they should have reserved for live prey training. Showed them playing. Playing. "This one's from about 2 weeks ago." Finley scrolled to another file. "Taught them a human game called hide and seek. Basically, someone hides, others try to find them. Good for practicing stealth and tracking, but also..." "Fun," Uxmoth finished, his voice strange. "Yeah, fun. Kids need that." The next clip showed something that made Hixcor's breath catch. Finley was reading from a datapad, and all 3 cubs were curled around him, listening with rapt attention. Ixpel kept interrupting with questions that Finley answered patiently, without irritation or correction. "That's a human story about a group of heroes who protected their city," Finley said. They asked about the tactical decisions, about why the heroes did what they did. We talked about it for almost 2 hours. They asked questions. Uxmoth repeated the words like they were in an alien language. "Of course they asked questions. They're smart, curious kids. That's what smart, curious kids do." Caltherian cubs do not question. They observe, learn, and execute. "Yeah, well, yours question." Finley's expression held something like defiance. "Ixpel wants to know the reasoning behind strategies. Morthic thinks about alternative approaches. Hulinai asks about the emotional states of people in stories, tries to understand motivations. They're incredible, Admiral. You should hear them think." Something was happening to Uxmoth's expression that Hixcor had never seen before. The Admiral was known for exactly 2 emotional states: controlled tactical assessment and controlled tactical rage. This was neither. This was something uncharted. "Show me more," Uxmoth said. Finley obliged. More footage, more moments of cubs being cubs, playing games, asking questions. At one point, the video showed Finley carefully examining Ixpel's shoulder scales, applying some human medicinal substance to the stress-damaged areas while explaining what he was doing and why. The cub sat still, listening, trusting. Another clip showed Morthic fighting sleep, head nodding, while Finley gently suggested he rest. The cub's resistance lasted maybe 30 seconds before he curled up and dropped into immediate, deep unconsciousness. He was awake for 33 hours straight before that, Finley said quietly. Training exercise, then combat assessment, then tactical review, then more drills. He was exhausted. They all were. The training schedule is rigorous by design. It's abusive. The word hit like a physical blow. Uxmoth's scales bristled, an aggressive display that would have sent most beings scrambling for cover. Finley didn't move. Couldn't move, really, with 3 cubs on him. But he met the Admiral's stare anyway. "It is not abuse," Uxmoth said, his voice dangerously low. "It is preparation. The galaxy is hostile. Caltharian warriors must be stronger than any threat they face. This has been our way for generations." "And how many of those warriors were happy?" Finley asked. "How many of them got to be kids first?" "Happiness is not the point. Yeah, I figured you'd say that." Finley looked down at the sleeping cubs, his expression softening. "But here's the thing, Admiral. I've spent 5 weeks watching your kids sneak away from everything they're supposed to be doing just to come here and be children for a few hours. They're desperate for it. They need it. What they need is discipline, structure, training that will keep them alive in combat. What they need is balance." Finley's voice stayed calm, reasonable. "Look, I'm not saying stop the training. I'm saying maybe, just maybe, they'd be better soldiers if they weren't constantly stressed, sleep-deprived, and terrified of disappointing you." Uxmoth went very still. "They are not terrified of me. Hulnai asked me last week if I thought you'd still be proud of her, even if she wasn't the best fighter in her class." Finley let that sink in. "She's 8 years old, Admiral. She should be worried about whether she gets to play with her friends, not whether her father will still love her if she's not perfect." The silence stretched. Hickscore watched his commanding officer, the undefeated fleet admiral, the warrior who'd broken siege lines and shattered enemy formations, struggle with something that had no tactical solution. Finally, Uxmoth spoke. "I was raised under the same protocols, as was my broodfather before me. We survived. We excelled." "Did you?" Finley asked gently. "Or did you just learn to hide the damage?" The question hung in the air like smoke from weapons fire. Uxmoth looked at his sleeping offspring. At Ixpel, scales damaged from stress she shouldn't have to carry. At Morthic, finally getting the rest his developing body desperately needed. At Hulnai, small and vulnerable and trusting in a way that contradicted everything Caltharian military doctrine taught about survival. "What would you have me do?" The Admiral's voice was quieter now. "Abandon their training? Raise them as soft as your species?" "No," Finley shook his head. "Raise them as strong as mine. And we do it differently than you think." Uxmoth's head tilted, a gesture of confusion that looked particularly odd on someone so thoroughly intimidating. "Humans are not strong. You are fragile, slow. You lack natural weapons or defenses." "Yeah, we do." Finley's smile held no humor. "Which is why we got creative. We built tools, developed tactics, formed bonds. We survived not because we were the strongest, but because we were adaptable, because we supported each other, because we understood that taking care of our people made them stronger, not weaker." "Philosophy," Uxmoth dismissed. "Words mean nothing in combat." "Then let's talk results." Finley pulled up another file on his datapad. 3 weeks ago, your kids ran a training simulation. Combat scenario, hostage extraction, standard tactical assessment. You remember it? Hicks Corps did. The Cubs had performed adequately, but not exceptionally. Middle rankings in their age group. They scored 68th percentile, Uxmoth said, and something like disappointment crept into his voice. Below expectations for offspring of my bloodline. Right. Now look at this. Finley pulled up footage from yesterday. Unauthorized footage, Hicks Corps noted with alarm, which meant the human had somehow accessed restricted training files. Same scenario type, different variables, but equivalent difficulty. The video played. Hicks Corps leaned closer, watching. The Cubs moved differently. Ixpel took point, but instead of the rigid adherence to protocol she'd shown before, she adapted mid-approach when the simulation threw an unexpected variable. She signaled her siblings, hand gestures they'd clearly developed themselves, not standard military signs, and they shifted formation fluidly. Morthic, who'd been struggling with tactical assessment due to exhaustion, called out enemy positions with the kind of clarity that suggested an actually rested mind could process information effectively. Novel concept, Holnai, instead of the hesitant uncertainty she usually displayed, moved with confidence. When the simulation presented a choice between two routes, she made the call immediately, and her siblings trusted her judgment without question. They completed the scenario in half the expected time. Top percentile for their age group. That was yesterday, Finley said, after 5 weeks of them coming here, playing games, asking questions, and, here's the radical part, sleeping properly. Uxmoth watched the footage repeat, watched his offspring demonstrate teamwork that transcended standard training protocols, watched them think creatively, communicate effectively, trust each other implicitly. This is anomalous, the Admiral said, but his conviction wavered. One simulation. Want to see the others? Finley pulled up more files. They've been improving consistently, not because they're training harder. They can't possibly train harder than they already were, but because they're recovering properly, because they're developing psychological resilience alongside physical capability, because someone's treating them like people instead of weapons in progress. Hicks Corps found himself studying the data despite his better judgment. The pattern was undeniable. The Cubs' performance metrics had climbed steadily over the past 5 weeks. Response times improved, strategic thinking more sophisticated, team coordination nearly perfect, all coinciding with their unauthorized visits to a human who fed them popcorn and let them watch children's programs. Humans, Finley continued, warming to his argument, produce some of the most effective soldiers in known space. Not the strongest physically, not the fastest, but effective. You know why? Because we start by building confident, well-adjusted children. We teach them they have value beyond their combat utility. We let them develop interests, ask questions, form connections. Then, when they choose to become warriors, they're fighting for something they believe in, not just following orders because they're too broken to imagine anything else. You call Caltharian warriors broken? Uxmoth's voice carried warning. I'm saying maybe they could be even better if they weren't. Finley met his stare. Your people are incredible fighters, Admiral, but fighting isn't the same as winning. Humans learned that the hard way. The soldiers who came home intact weren't just the ones who survived combat. They were the ones who had something worth coming home to. The ones who understood why they were fighting, not just how. Uxmoth was quiet for a long moment. Then, this is how humans raise their warriors? Some of them. The good ones. Finley glanced at the sleeping cubs. Look, I don't know everything about Caltharian culture. Maybe I'm completely wrong about all of this, but I know what I see. 3 kids who were stressed, exhausted, and terrified of failure. 3 kids who started sneaking away from everything they were supposed to be doing just to find a place where they could be children for a few hours. And I know that after 5 weeks of letting them do that, they're performing better than ever. They violated protocol, abandoned their schedules. They took care of themselves when the system wouldn't, Finley countered. That's initiative, Admiral. That's creative problem-solving. Those are exactly the traits you want in military personnel, aren't they? Hickscore watched Uxmoth process this, watched centuries of cultural certainty collide with empirical evidence. The Admiral looked at the data, at the footage, at his sleeping offspring. Then he did something Hickscore had never seen. He sat down, just lowered himself to the floor beside Finley's resting surface, close enough to reach out and touch Ixpel's shoulder ridges. The cub stirred slightly at her father's proximity, made a small sound, then settled again. "I do not know how to be what you describe," Uxmoth said quietly. "I was trained as they are being trained. Harshly. Completely. Without room for weakness or doubt. It made me an effective commander. Did it make you happy?" The Admiral's laugh was bitter. "Happiness is not a military objective." "Maybe it should be, at least sometimes." Finley shifted, trying once again to extract himself from the pile of cubs. This time, he managed to slide partially free, though Hulnai immediately grabbed for him, making a distressed chirp. He scooped her up instinctively, settling her against his shoulder where she could maintain contact. "Look at her, Admiral. She's 8. She should be playing and learning and figuring out who she is. Instead, she's developing anxiety disorders because she's terrified of disappointing you." Uxmoth reached out slowly, carefully, and touched Hulnai's head. The cub, still mostly asleep, leaned into the contact with a small, contented sound. "I thought I was preparing them," the Admiral said, "for a dangerous galaxy, for threats they would face. You are, but you're also damaging them in the process." Finley's voice gentled. "There's a human saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You're demanding everything from them without giving them a chance to refill. Eventually, they'll break. Maybe not physically, but in ways that matter just as much." "What would you have me do?" Uxmoth looked up, and for the first time, Hickscore saw something other than certainty in his commander's eyes. "I do not know another way. Let me show you." The offer hung in the air. "You!" Uxmoth's skepticism returned. "A human maintenance technician will instruct a Caltharian fleet admiral on raising warriors?" "No." Finley smiled slightly. "A guy who knows about kids will show a father how to let his children be children sometimes. The warrior part, that's still yours. I'm not trying to make them soft. I'm trying to make them whole." Uxmoth was silent for a long time, his claws tapping a slow rhythm against the floor. Thinking, calculating, weighing options the way he would tactical scenarios. Finally, "What is your proposal?" "Let me work with them. Officially, not sneaking around. A few hours every other day. We play, we talk, we let them be kids. They still do all their training, all their assessments, everything your protocols require. But they also get time to recover, to process, to just exist without constant pressure. This is unprecedented. So is their improvement in the simulations." Finley gestured at the data still displayed on his pad. "You're a tactical commander, Admiral. You make decisions based on results. The results are right there. 5 weeks of letting them decompress, and they're outperforming their previous metrics significantly. What does that tell you?" Uxmoth looked at the numbers, at his cubs, at the human who'd somehow, impossibly, noticed things about his offspring that he'd missed, at Hulnai, small and trusting, sleeping against Finley's shoulder with the kind of peace that suggested she felt safe for the first time in weeks. "If I agree to this," Uxmoth said slowly, "it will be monitored, assessed. The moment their performance declines, it won't." Finley's confidence was absolute. "They're good kids, Admiral. They're smart, capable, strong. They just need someone to see that instead of only seeing what they're not yet. And you believe you can provide this? I believe I can try. And I believe you love them enough to let me." The words struck something in Uxmoth's expression. Love. Not a concept Caltharian military doctrine spent much time on. Loyalty? Yes. Duty? Absolutely. But love was considered a weakness, an emotional liability that compromised tactical judgment. Except Uxmoth was looking at his cubs like they were the only thing in the universe that mattered. "One condition," the Admiral said finally. "Name it. You teach me as well." Uxmoth's voice held something that might have been vulnerability. "I do not know how to do what you describe. How to balance discipline with whatever this is. If you are to work with my offspring, I would learn your methods." Finley blinked. "You want parenting lessons from a human? I want to understand why my cubs choose your company over their assigned duties. I want to know how to make them feel the way they clearly feel here." Uxmoth touched Ixpel's scales again, gentle despite his considerable strength. "I want them to look at me the way they look at you." The admission cost him. Hixcore could see it in the tension of the Admiral's shoulders, the way his secondary eyelids flickered. Uxmoth had just acknowledged inadequacy in front of subordinates, had admitted to emotional needs that Caltharian culture considered beneath military personnel. Finley seemed to understand the weight of it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I can do that." The official designation in the station records read Cultural Exchange Program, Human Caltharian Developmental Protocols, which was a bureaucratic way of saying Finley's quarters had become the galaxy's most unlikely daycare center. The first official session happened 3 days later. Uxmoth arrived precisely on time, in full military regalia, looking like he was preparing for a strategic summit, rather than spending time with his own offspring. "You can relax," Finley said, gesturing to the cushioned surfaces he'd arranged. "This isn't a briefing." "I do not relax." "Yeah, I'm getting that impression." Finley pulled out a container of popcorn. "The kids'll be here in a few minutes. Before they arrive, ground rules. No critiquing their performance. No correcting their posture. No turning playtime into a teaching opportunity unless they ask. Just be with them." "Can you do that?" Uxmoth looked like he'd been asked to calculate faster-than-light trajectories without a computer. "Be with them." "Yeah, talk. Listen. Let them lead the conversation." Finley paused. "When's the last time you asked them about their interests?" "Their interests are combat training and tactical—" "Their actual interests, Admiral. Things they like. Things they're curious about. Things that have nothing to do with military service." The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Right," Finley said. "Let's start there." The cubs arrived moments later, and their reaction to finding their father in Finley's quarters was immediate wariness. They stood at attention automatically, waiting for inspection or instruction. "Hey, troublemakers," Finley greeted them, deliberately casual. "Movie night. You three get to pick what we watch." Ixpel glanced at her father uncertainly. "Father is staying." "If that's acceptable," Uxmoth said, and the phrasing, requesting rather than commanding, made all 3 cubs stare. "He wants to understand what we do here," Finley explained. "That okay with you?" The cubs exchanged glances, having entire conversations in looks that spoke to their sibling bond. Finally, Morthic nodded. The one with the space explorers. What followed was 2 hours of Uxmoth watching his offspring be children, watching them argue cheerfully about plot points, laugh at the humorous moments, ask Finley questions about human technology versus the fictional versions on screen. Watching Hulnai eventually migrate to Finley's side, then, hesitantly, like approaching something dangerous, lean against her father instead. Uxmoth went very still. Then, with the careful precision of someone diffusing explosives, he adjusted his position to make her more comfortable. Hulnai's purr was so quiet it was almost inaudible. Almost. After the cubs left, Uxmoth sat in silence for long minutes. They were different, he said finally. Then in training. Then in my presence, normally. They were relaxed, Finley corrected. That's what kids look like when they're not stressed. Hulnai chose to sit with me. Yeah, she did. Because you let her, instead of telling her to maintain proper posture or focus on the content. I did nothing. Exactly. Finley smiled. Sometimes that's exactly what they need. The sessions continued, twice weekly at first, then more frequently as other officers noticed the Cubs' continued performance improvements and began asking questions. Hickscore found himself authorizing similar arrangements for other Cubs whose parents approached him with carefully worded requests that boiled down to, "My offspring are struggling, and I do not know how to help them." Finley's quarters couldn't accommodate everyone, so they repurposed a recreation space that had been used for combat meditation, turned it into something unprecedented, a place where Caltharian Cubs could play. The changes rippled outward. Cubs who'd been developing stress disorders began recovering. Performance metrics across the youth training programs climbed steadily. More importantly, though this was harder to quantify, the Cubs seemed happier. They asked more questions during tactical training, engaged more creatively with problems, worked together with genuine trust instead of just coordinated efficiency. And the adults started changing too. Hickscore caught himself asking his own offspring about their day. Not their training scores, but their actual experiences. Found that they had opinions, interests, thoughts beyond what he'd programmed into them through relentless discipline. Other officers began scheduling what they awkwardly called non-training intervals, time where Cubs could just exist without evaluation or assessment. The concept spread through the fleet. Other stations requested information on the human developmental integration protocols. Finley, to his obvious bewilderment, became the most consulted human in Caltharian space on matters having nothing to do with equipment maintenance. 4 months after 3 Cubs had been found sleeping on a human's shoulder, Fleet Admiral Uxmoth filed an official report recommending systematic reform of Caltharian youth training protocols. The document cited empirical evidence, improved performance, better psychological resilience, enhanced creative thinking. It also included a single personal note, buried in the appendices where most wouldn't notice. My offspring smile now. I did not know they could. I did not know I wanted them to. But watching Ixpel laugh at a human joke, seeing Morthic excitedly explain a tactical theory he developed himself, hearing Hulnai ask me to read her a story, these moments have value beyond military utility. They have reminded me that we are raising people, not just warriors, and perhaps people make better warriors than we believed. The reforms passed, not quickly, and not without resistance, but they passed. And in a small quarters on Station Kethel Prime, Finley sat surrounded by a pile of Caltharian Cubs, not just Uxmoth's 3 anymore, but a rotating group who'd learned that the weird human with the strange food and infinite patience was a safe harbor in their structured, demanding lives. "All right, troublemakers," he said, pulling up another movie. "Who wants popcorn?" The enthusiastic response was multilingual, multi-species, and absolutely deafening. Finley grinned, reached for the snacks, and reflected that he'd come to this station to fix environmental systems. Instead, he'd accidentally fixed something far more important. The idea that strength and kindness weren't opposites. That caring for people didn't make them weak. That sometimes the most tactical decision was simply letting children be children first, and warriors second. The galaxy, as it turned out, was learning that humans didn't conquer through superior weapons or advanced technology. They conquered through something far more dangerous. The radical notion that compassion made you stronger, not weaker. And somehow, against all odds and military protocol, that changed everything.